Imagine a world where wealth and power hide in plain sight, where a handshake at a steakhouse could change the future of an entire empire, and where the man pulling the strings prefers tailored suits, fine dining, and the quiet profits of construction deals over the roar of street gunfire. His soldiers may have carried pistols, but he carried contracts. To outsiders, he looked more like a businessman than a gangster. To insiders, he was the Don who believed respect and loyalty were worth more than bullets. But in the shadows of New York City, everyone knew the truth. Paul Castellano was no ordinary businessman. He was a boss, and his rise to power was as unlikely as it was inevitable. Paul Castellano was born in Brooklyn in 1915, the son of Sicilian immigrants who carried old traditions across the ocean and planted them in New York's crowded neighborhoods. His father worked as a butcher, and young Paul grew up learning the value of hard labor. But he also absorbed something else: the quiet codes of respect, loyalty, and silence that governed men from the old country. In those streets, disputes were settled not by courts but by whispers, favors, and sometimes by fists. Unlike some of his contemporaries who found their way into crime through reckless bravado, Paul carried himself with calm calculation. He wasn't the loudest, nor the quickest to fight, but he had a sharp mind and an instinct for survival. School never held his interest. He left formal education behind after the 8th grade. But the butcher shop and the streets became his classroom. There, he studied people, learning how to read faces, sense intentions, and calculate advantage. His connection to power grew not simply through ambition, but through family. Paul's sister married into the Gambino family, and through that marriage, Paul became linked to Carlo Gambino, one of the most respected bosses of his time. To be tied by blood and marriage to such a man was more than luck. It was destiny. Carlo saw in Paul not just a relative, but a man with the patience and intelligence to handle business in ways others could not. Paul began to rise quietly, running errands, overseeing small rackets, and managing gambling operations. He was careful, rarely drawing attention to himself. Where others reveled in street fights, Paul looked for ways to turn conflict into profit. He understood that in New York, opportunity often wore the mask of risk, and the men who thrived were the ones who knew when to fight and when to shake hands. As the years passed, Paul carved out his reputation not as a trigger man but as a businessman. He leaned into industries that seemed legitimate: construction, trucking, unions, sectors where contracts could be manipulated, bids could be rigged, and money flowed steadily without the noise of gunfire. His skills made him indispensable, and his connection to Carlo Gambino gave him protection few others enjoyed. By the 1950s, Paul was no longer a street-level figure. He had become known as a man who could be trusted to handle money, to make deals, to keep operations clean. He was still very much part of the underworld, but he carried himself as though he belonged in boardrooms rather than back alleys. This duality, gangster and businessman, set him apart. Some called him the Howard Hughes of the mob, a title he accepted with quiet pride. Despite his business-like demeanor, Paul understood the rules of the life he had chosen. Respect was the currency, and loyalty was non-negotiable. He carried himself with dignity, demanding it from others and offering it in return. Those who worked for him saw a man who valued order over chaos, stability over recklessness. But beneath the calm exterior, there was steel. Castellano could forgive mistakes but never betrayal, and his reputation as a man not to be crossed grew with each passing year. In his personal life, Paul maintained the same mix of tradition and ambition. He married his childhood sweetheart, Nina Mano, and together they built a family. Their Staten Island mansion, later dubbed the White House, became a symbol of both his wealth and his desire to live above the grime of street-level crime. To neighbors, he was a successful businessman who enjoyed the finer things in life. To those in the know, the mansion was a fortress, a place where meetings were held and decisions that shaped the underworld were quietly made. As the decades turned, Paul's star continued to rise within the Gambino family. Carlo Gambino relied heavily on him, trusting him with sensitive operations, particularly those that required discretion and finesse. Castellano wasn't flashy like some mobsters who craved attention. He preferred quiet power, the kind that came from influence rather than notoriety. His voice didn't need to be loud. It carried weight because everyone knew where it came from. By the time Carlo Gambino's health began to fail in the mid-1970s, Paul Castellano was already seen as one of his most trusted men. The question of succession loomed large over the family. Would the next boss be a street-hardened capo, loved by the soldiers who lived by their guns? Or would it be Paul, the businessman who had Carlo's blessing and the intelligence to keep the family thriving in white-collar enterprises? For years, Paul had stayed patient, building his reputation, strengthening his alliances, and waiting for the moment when his path would be clear. That moment was fast approaching. By the mid-1970s, Carlo Gambino's health was failing, and whispers of succession moved through the streets and social clubs of New York like a cold wind. Carlo had ruled the Gambino family with a steady hand, balancing tradition with pragmatism, keeping violence controlled and profits steady. His men respected him not only for his cunning, but for his ability to maintain peace among the five families. But now, with his health declining, everyone wondered who would inherit the mantle of power. For many, the obvious choice seemed to be Agnello Della Croce, the underboss who had served Carlo faithfully for years. Della Croce was a street boss, deeply respected by the soldiers who made their living in the trenches of loan sharking, gambling, and protection rackets. He had charisma, the loyalty of the rank and file, and the aura of a man who lived by the old codes. To the soldiers who sweated in the clubs and on the corners, Della Croce was their champion. But Carlo Gambino had other ideas. He valued brains over brawn, and he saw the future of organized crime not in street-level violence but in the white-collar rackets that could generate millions without drawing headlines. To Carlo, the man who best embodied this vision was not Della Croce, but Paul Castellano. Paul had spent decades proving himself as a quiet strategist, a master of contracts and unions, a man who could manipulate industries with the stroke of a pen. His Staten Island mansion reflected his ambitions, a life above the street, closer to businessmen than to soldiers. When Carlo Gambino died in 1976, his decision stunned many. He had named Paul Castellano his successor, bypassing Della Croce. To outsiders, it seemed logical. Paul was family by marriage, a trusted confidant, and a man who could protect the family's vast rackets in construction and trucking. But inside the Gambino family, the choice split loyalties. The rank and file adored Della Croce, and though he accepted Carlo's wishes with grace, the seeds of resentment were planted. Paul Castellano became boss of the Gambino family, stepping into the role with the confidence of a man who had prepared for this moment his entire life. He saw himself not as a street boss, but as a corporate CEO, running the family like a business conglomerate. His focus was on industries that offered steady profits, construction unions, garment trucking, and high-end extortion schemes. He considered street crimes like hijackings and drug dealing beneath him, messy ventures that attracted unwanted attention. In many ways, Paul's leadership style mirrored his personality, controlled, methodical, calculating. He hosted meetings at his Staten Island mansion, the so-called White House, where he entertained allies with fine food and wine. He preferred discussions at long dining tables over whispers in smoky back rooms. He demanded respect, not through constant displays of violence, but through authority and presence. To him, the Gambino family was not a gang. It was an empire. But not everyone shared his vision. The younger soldiers, particularly those connected to Della Croce, bristled under Castellano's leadership. They felt he looked down on them, that he dismissed their way of life as crude and outdated. To men who had risked their lives in the streets, Paul seemed distant, too absorbed in white-collar deals, too insulated in his mansion. He rarely visited the clubs where soldiers gathered. Instead, he preferred the company of businessmen, lawyers, and contractors. To some, he seemed more like a corporate executive than a mob boss. The resentment deepened as Paul imposed stricter rules. He demanded bigger cuts from operations, particularly from drug dealing. Though he officially forbade Gambino members from touching narcotics, he knew many were involved. His demands for tribute felt like hypocrisy. If he took the money, wasn't he complicit? The soldiers grumbled, but few dared to challenge him openly. His position as Carlo Gambino's hand-picked successor gave him undeniable authority. Agnello della Croce, ever the loyal underboss, tried to keep the peace. He urged his men to respect Castellano's leadership, reminding them that loyalty to the boss was sacred, but even he couldn't extinguish the frustration simmering beneath the surface. Della Croce's men admired their mentor, but they didn't share Castellano's vision of a mob that operated like a corporation. They wanted a leader who understood their struggles, who shared their world, not a don who dined in seclusion while they scraped in the streets. Meanwhile, Paul tightened his grip on business. He extended the family's reach deeper into the construction industry, ensuring that no major building project in New York could move forward without the Gambino family's blessing. Contractors paid inflated costs, unions bent to his will, and the money poured in. Castellano saw himself as a visionary, guiding the family away from risky ventures into sustainable wealth. He believed he was elevating the Gambino family above the chaos of street gangs, securing its place as a sophisticated organization. But the more he distanced himself from the soldiers, the more isolated he became. His Staten Island mansion became both a symbol of his wealth and a fortress that separated him from the men who served him. While other bosses occasionally appeared in the neighborhoods, shaking hands and reminding soldiers of their presence, Paul preferred seclusion. It was a strategy that worked in business but faltered in the underworld, where presence was often as important as power. In the late 1970s, cracks began to show. Castellano's authority was secure on paper, but the undercurrents of resentment were growing stronger. Younger capos, ambitious and eager for recognition, whispered in back rooms about his arrogance. Soldiers grumbled about his demands. Even as the money flowed, the loyalty that bound the family began to fray. Still, Paul remained confident. To him, the discontent of a few soldiers was insignificant compared to the empire he was building. He believed his way was the future, that the Gambino family could thrive not by risking everything in violent street wars, but by embedding itself quietly in the industries that built New York. And for a time, he was right. The family's coffers swelled, its influence stretched across the city, and Paul Castellano sat at the head of the table, certain that his vision would secure the family's power for generations. What he couldn't see, or refused to see, was that in sidelining the soldiers who craved recognition, he was sowing the seeds of his own downfall. By the end of the 1970s, Paul Castellano stood at the top of the Gambino family, presiding over the most powerful of New York's 5 families. From his Staten Island mansion, the so-called White House, he orchestrated an empire that stretched across construction, trucking, labor unions, and the garment district. He ran the family less like a traditional mob boss and more like a corporate executive, favoring balance sheets over shootouts, contracts over confrontations. To him, violence was a last resort, something messy that risked headlines and arrests. Money was cleaner, and the way to real power was through control of industries that looked legitimate on the surface. His strategy paid off. Castellano ensured that no skyscraper in Manhattan could rise without Gambino influence, no concrete could be poured without a payoff, no garment truck could move without tribute. The family's reach extended from the streets to the boardrooms, and Paul basked in the profits. He surrounded himself with trusted aides who shared his preference for business over blood, men who managed union bosses like puppets and smoothed deals with contractors who understood that paying was cheaper than fighting. Yet as Paul consolidated wealth, resentment brewed in the shadows. The soldiers and captains who worked the streets felt increasingly alienated. They looked at Castellano's mansion, his tailored suits, his lavish dinners, and saw a man who had forgotten the life. He rarely visited social clubs, rarely mingled with the men whose sweat and risk fueled the family's fortune. To them, he wasn't a boss in the old tradition. He was distant, aloof, too focused on contracts and corporate fronts to understand the pulse of the street. At the heart of this divide was Agnello della Croce, the underboss who had been passed over when Carlo Gambino chose Castellano as successor. Della Croce accepted the decision with grace, but his followers never forgot the slight. They were men of the street, loyal to Della Croce's old-school ways, and they saw Castellano as an outsider in his own family. Della Croce himself worked to keep the peace, urging loyalty to Paul and reminding his men that obedience was the backbone of their world. But the grumbling never ceased. Among those restless under Della Croce's wing was a rising figure named John Gotti. Unlike Castellano, Gotti thrived on street presence. He was charismatic, brash, and deeply respected by the younger soldiers. Where Castellano hid behind contracts, Gotti wore his reputation openly, flashing charm and menace in equal measure. His crew, based out of the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Queens, operated in gambling, loan sharking, and increasingly narcotics, a business Castellano openly despised. Drugs were a dividing line. Castellano had forbidden Gambino members from dealing, fearing the long prison sentences and law enforcement attention that came with narcotics. Yet everyone knew many soldiers were involved. The profits were too large, the demand too high, and the temptation too strong. Gotti and others continued in secret, feeding the growing rift. When Castellano discovered these operations, his fury was sharp. He demanded heavier tribute from those suspected of drug activity, condemning them while profiting from their work. To the soldiers, it was hypocrisy. He wanted the money but scorned the men who earned it. Still, Castellano's grip on business was undeniable. He controlled the meat and poultry industries, leveraged influence in trucking unions, and reaped millions from construction. His reach extended into Wall Street, where brokers and bankers found themselves tied to mob money whether they knew it or not. To the outside world, he appeared more like a businessman than a gangster, and that was exactly how he wanted it. He preferred the image of respectability, of deals, made at polished tables instead of dimly lit bars. But the streets told a different story. Violence still simmered between families, and even Castellano couldn't avoid it. Disputes with the Genovese and Lucchese families over construction rackets flared, requiring negotiations that tested his patience. Castellano wanted peace, but peace required compromise, and compromise sometimes meant appearing weak. For a man obsessed with authority, that was unacceptable. He tightened control, demanded more respect, and expected absolute obedience. Inside his mansion, Castellano lived like a man convinced of his own superiority. He dined on gourmet meals, obsessed over recipes, and kept butchers on retainer to supply the finest cuts of meat. He surrounded himself with wealth and insulated himself from the grit of the life. For his supporters, it was proof that he had elevated the Gambino family to heights of sophistication. For his critics, it was proof that he had lost touch. The discontent grew louder as the decade closed. Soldiers whispered that Castellano was more interested in his own wealth than the welfare of the men who risked prison and death. Younger capos grumbled that their sacrifices went unnoticed, their loyalty unappreciated. Castellano's insistence on larger tributes, especially from drug-connected operations, deepened the divide. Even those who respected his business acumen began to question whether he understood what it meant to lead men who still lived by the gun. John Gotti's star rose in this climate of frustration. He embodied everything Castellano did not. He was accessible, visible, and unafraid to embrace the traditions of street leadership. Men gathered at his club in Queens, drawn by his charisma and the sense that he understood them in ways Castellano never could. The contrast between the two men became sharper with each passing year. The aloof boss in his mansion, and the street general surrounded by loyal soldiers. Paul Castellano believed his vision would secure the Gambino family for the future, that his white-collar empire would outlast the reckless ventures of the past. But in sidelining the soldiers, in underestimating the hunger of men like Gotti, he was building not only his fortune, but the foundation of his downfall. By the early 1980s, Paul Castellano's position as boss of the Gambino family was secure on paper, but beneath the surface his grip was loosening. He still commanded immense wealth and influence, but the way he lived, the way he ruled, and even the way he carried himself made him seem distant from the men whose loyalty kept him in power. The streets of New York whispered not only about his business dealings, but about the personal choices that, for many, tarnished his image as a leader. His Staten Island mansion, nicknamed the White House, became both a symbol of his wealth and a point of resentment. Where other bosses frequented social clubs, showing their faces and mingling with soldiers, Castellano retreated into luxury. Behind its gates, he lived like an executive surrounded by family and select confidants. His evenings were spent at long dining tables, tasting gourmet meals, testing new recipes, and entertaining guests in comfort. The men who worked in the streets rarely saw him, and when they did, it was usually to hand over envelopes of cash. His aloofness created distance, and distance in the underworld often bred distrust. Inside the mansion, a scandal quietly unfolded that further eroded his standing. Castellano, a man who preached tradition and family values, carried on an affair with his live-in maid, Gloria Olarte. The relationship was whispered about behind closed doors, and though the mob lived by a code where mistresses were hardly unusual, Castellano's choice was seen as careless. He flaunted the relationship under the same roof where his wife Nina lived, and it exposed him to ridicule. For soldiers already disillusioned by his arrogance, this personal scandal confirmed their sense that the boss was a hypocrite. Meanwhile, Castellano's business-first philosophy clashed with the reality of the streets. He demanded strict control of operations, insisting that every deal, every racket, every dollar flow upward. His obsession with money extended to details that many thought beneath a boss. He installed electronic surveillance in his own home, recording conversations in order to monitor both family business and his household. When the FBI eventually discovered these tapes, they captured not only Castellano's business discussions, but also intimate, even embarrassing details of his personal life. Word of the tapes spread among the men, damaging his aura of authority. His ban on narcotics remained one of his most contentious policies. Castellano despised the drug trade, viewing it as reckless and destructive. He understood that narcotics brought massive profits, but he believed the risks of long prison terms and government crackdowns outweighed the rewards. To him, drugs were poison, not only for society, but for the stability of his family. Yet everyone knew many Gambino soldiers were dealing behind his back, including John Gotti's crew in Queens. Castellano demanded heavy tributes from those suspected of drug money, condemning them while pocketing their profits. The contradiction bred resentment. Soldiers saw it as hypocrisy. If the money was dirty, why take it? And if it was acceptable to take, why condemn them for earning it? The more Paul tried to control, the more his men pulled away. He insisted on bigger cuts, ordered strict obedience, and punished disobedience harshly. To him, this was leadership. To many soldiers, it was tyranny. His detachment from the street only made matters worse. Gambino men often joked that Castellano wasn't a gangster at all, but a businessman who happened to wear their crown. The respect that came naturally to bosses like Carlo Gambino, or even Agnello Della Croce, had to be demanded by Castellano. Respect that must be demanded, however, rarely lasts. Even Della Croce, ever the peacemaker, found it difficult to hold back the growing unrest. His men, loyal to him but not to Castellano, complained that they were being squeezed dry, that the boss didn't understand them. Della Croce urged patience, reminding them that loyalty was sacred, that rebellion was unthinkable, but even his influence had limits. The more Castellano demanded, the more his soldiers questioned his right to rule. At the same time, Castellano's ambition drove him further into the world of white-collar rackets. He was fascinated by the possibilities of Wall Street scams, stock manipulation, and sophisticated fraud. He dreamed of transforming the Gambino family into something more like a multinational corporation than a street gang. To him, the future of organized crime was not gambling dens and dice games. It was construction contracts, trucking monopolies, and financial schemes that could generate millions without a single shot fired. He was, in many ways, ahead of his time. But to the soldiers risking prison in the alleys of Queens and Brooklyn, it was another reminder that he lived in a different world. The divide became sharper with every passing year. On one side stood Castellano, secluded in his mansion, dreaming of white-collar dominance. On the other stood men like John Gotti, who embodied the traditional gangster image, visible, charismatic, and unafraid of the spotlight. Soldiers flocked to Gotti not only because of his success, but because he gave them something Castellano never could: a sense of belonging, of recognition, of pride in the life they had chosen. By the early 1980s, the Gambino family was rich beyond imagination, but it was also fractured. Castellano still believed his vision would secure the family for the future, but his insistence on control, his hypocrisy on drugs, and his personal scandals had eroded the foundation of loyalty that every boss needs. He sat in his mansion surrounded by wealth, convinced of his superiority, but outside those walls the whispers grew louder. Paul Castellano had everything: money, power, position. But what he lacked was the one thing no boss could survive without: the unwavering loyalty of his men. And in New York, when loyalty falters, betrayal is never far behind. The early 1980s tested the foundations of the Gambino family like never before. On the surface, Paul Castellano remained the most powerful mafia boss in America. His empire stretched across New York's construction industry, its trucking unions, and lucrative garment rackets. He had the respect of the Commission, the governing council of the five families, and he carried himself as though his authority were unshakable. But inside his own ranks, loyalty was unraveling thread by thread, and Paul either couldn't see it or refused to admit it. Agnello Della Croce had long been the glue that kept the Gambino family from splitting apart. He was Castellano's underboss, but more importantly, he was the man the soldiers truly loved. Della Croce was old school, tough, charismatic, loyal to the code. He had accepted being passed over for the top spot out of respect for Carlo Gambino's wishes, but his men never forgot the slight. They tolerated Castellano not out of admiration, but out of loyalty to Della Croce, who constantly preached patience and obedience. Della Croce's presence was a shield for Castellano. Whenever the younger soldiers complained about the boss's arrogance, his isolation, or his hypocrisy on narcotics, Della Croce calmed them. He reminded them that loyalty to the family was sacred, that rebellion was suicide. His word carried weight, and his men listened. But by the early 1980s, Della Croce's health was failing. He was stricken with cancer, and as his strength faded, so too did his ability to restrain the anger boiling beneath the surface. Paul Castellano, for his part, seemed unaware of how deeply dependent his reign was on Della Croce's influence. He continued living in seclusion in his Staten Island mansion, continuing his affair with his maid, Gloria Olarte, and immersing himself in business ventures that looked more like Wall Street schemes than mob rackets. He dreamed of transforming the Gambino family into a corporate empire, but his soldiers dreamed of respect and recognition, things they felt Castellano denied them. The issue of narcotics remained a constant flashpoint. Castellano's ban on drug dealing was absolute in theory but uneven in practice. He denounced it as dangerous, yet demanded heavy tributes from those he suspected were involved. John Gotti's crew in Queens was heavily invested in heroin distribution, and Castellano knew it. His anger was fierce, but he hesitated to act decisively. Removing Gotti risked open rebellion, and Paul relied on the loyalty of Della Croce to keep Gotti in line. But as Della Croce grew weaker, Gotti grew bolder. By 1985, Della Croce was near death, and the Gambino family was at a breaking point. Castellano made decisions that further alienated his soldiers. He promoted men loyal to himself rather than those favored by the street. He demanded ever larger tributes, squeezing crews that were already restless. Worst of all, he treated his soldiers with disdain, speaking of them as though they were employees rather than brothers bound by blood and loyalty. In the underworld, respect mattered as much as money, and Castellano gave little of it. The FBI added to his troubles. Agents had bugged Castellano's Staten Island mansion, and the tapes they recorded captured him not only discussing business but making crude, embarrassing comments that damaged his dignity in the eyes of his men. The FBI also bugged the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club, John Gotti's headquarters, and they heard the grumbling of soldiers who felt abandoned by their boss. Law enforcement pressure mounted, and Castellano's ability to keep his men united shrank. In December 1985, Agnello Della Croce died. His funeral was crowded with mourners, men who had followed him for decades, men who respected him more than they ever respected Castellano. For many, his passing was the moment they had dreaded. Without Della Croce, there was no one to hold them back, no one to keep their anger from boiling over. The balance of power within the Gambino family shifted immediately. Castellano made a critical mistake in the aftermath. Instead of attending Della Croce's funeral, a gesture that might have softened tensions, he stayed away, claiming he feared FBI surveillance. To the soldiers, it was a betrayal. A boss who would not honor his underboss in death was a boss who had lost touch with the values that bound the family together. John Gotti, who attended the funeral and stood with Della Croce's grieving men, emerged stronger than ever in their eyes. In the weeks that followed, Castellano's vulnerability became clearer. He faced indictment on federal charges, his authority was questioned in whispers, and his absence from Della Croce's funeral was viewed as unforgivable. At the same time, Gotti and his allies began plotting. They knew Castellano was isolated, despised by the soldiers, and viewed as arrogant by the men who actually risked their lives. His power was vast on paper, but in practice it was slipping through his fingers. Paul Castellano believed he still commanded respect, that his wealth and his vision for the family's future would protect him. He still held meetings in his mansion, still lived surrounded by luxury, still saw himself as the head of a dynasty. But his men were already making plans, and they didn't involve preserving his reign. The death of Agnello Della Croce had removed the last barrier between Castellano and the wrath of his soldiers. For John Gotti and his allies, the time for patience had ended. The future of the Gambino family would no longer be decided in boardrooms or at the dining tables of Staten Island. It would be decided on the streets of Manhattan, in a moment that would shock the underworld and change the course of Mafia history forever. By 1985, Paul Castellano was under more pressure than at any other time in his career. Federal prosecutors circled like vultures, stacking indictments against him for racketeering, labor corruption, and loan sharking. The FBI bug planted in his Staten Island mansion had recorded hours of incriminating conversations, capturing him discussing business, issuing orders, and even making crude remarks about his personal affairs. For decades, Castellano had built his power on the image of a man above the streets, a businessman in a world of gangsters. But now, the tapes made him sound small, petty, even ridiculous. The FBI's investigations left Castellano scrambling to maintain control. He hired lawyers, held long meetings with advisors, and tried to reassure his captains that the storm could be weathered. He believed his intellect and his connections would save him, as they had so many times before. But even as he prepared for court, his grip on the Gambino family weakened. The indictments weren't his only problem. Inside the family, discontent had grown into quiet defiance, and the man at the center of it was John Gotti. Gotti had spent years cultivating loyalty among the rank and file. His charisma drew men to him, his generosity kept them close, and his willingness to embrace the street gave them confidence. While Castellano remained isolated in his mansion, Gotti stood among his soldiers at the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club, shaking hands, telling jokes, listening to grievances. He made himself visible, accessible, the opposite of Castellano's aloof style. The contrast was striking, and men began to whisper that Gotti, not Castellano, was the leader they wanted. The resentment that had simmered during Agnello Della Croce's life now boiled over after his death. Della Croce had been the bridge between Castellano and the street, the man who commanded respect, even from those who hated the boss. Without him, there was nothing holding Gotti's faction back. Castellano's absence from Della Croce's funeral was the final insult. To many soldiers, it was proof that their boss didn't care about them, didn't respect their sacrifices, and didn't deserve their loyalty. As Castellano prepared for trial, Gotti and his closest allies began to plan something unthinkable: the assassination of their boss. In the old days, killing a boss without commission approval was nearly impossible. The rules of Cosa Nostra demanded respect for hierarchy, and such a move risked open war. But Gotti understood that Castellano's position was weaker than it seemed. The commission had its own frustrations with Castellano, and many of his peers in the other families saw him as arrogant, too focused on money, too disconnected from tradition. While no official blessing was given, the silence of other bosses spoke volumes. Inside the Gambino family, Gotti built his coalition carefully. He won over key captains, men who shared his disdain for Castellano's leadership and his ban on narcotics. They saw Gotti as one of their own, a man who understood the streets, who lived by the old ways, who would reward loyalty with loyalty. Meetings were held in secret, whispers carried through social clubs, and slowly, the plot took shape. Castellano remained oblivious. He believed his authority was still absolute, that the soldiers grumbling in the shadows would never dare defy him. He focused on his indictments, his lawyers, his mansion dinners. He continued to enforce his vision of a white-collar empire, scolding men for drug dealing while pocketing their money. He demanded respect, even as he gave little of it in return. To him, betrayal was unthinkable. He was the boss, handpicked by Carlo Gambino himself. Who would dare move against such a legacy? The truth was that Castellano had misread the temperature of his own family. He had confused fear with loyalty, obedience with respect. His soldiers no longer feared him, and they certainly didn't respect him. They saw him as vulnerable, distracted, and disconnected. And in the Mafia, once a boss is seen as weak, his fate is sealed. By the summer of 1985, Castellano's problems multiplied. He faced indictment not only for racketeering, but for his alleged role in the so-called commission case, a sweeping federal prosecution aimed at crippling New York's Mafia families. It was the most serious legal threat of his career, and it left him preoccupied and increasingly isolated. He held fewer meetings with captains, relying instead on a small circle of loyalists. This only deepened the perception that he was out of touch, hiding behind his mansion walls while his empire cracked. Meanwhile, Gotti tightened his plans. He met with trusted allies in quiet back rooms, laying out the details of Castellano's removal. They discussed logistics, weapons, timing. The risk was enormous, but the reward was greater. If Castellano fell, Gotti would rise. For Gotti, the decision wasn't just about power, it was about survival. Castellano had begun to suspect him and his crew of drug dealing, and there were whispers that he planned to remove Gotti permanently. To strike first was not only ambition, it was necessity. By late 1985, the plot was set. Gotti's men prepared themselves, knowing the consequences if they failed would be deadly. Castellano, still preoccupied with indictments and his private life, had no idea how close danger was. He continued to live as though his authority were unquestioned, unaware that his most trusted captains were already preparing the move that would end his reign. In the world Paul Castellano had built, loyalty was supposed to be unbreakable, respect eternal. But he had underestimated the hunger of the men beneath him, the allure of the streets he had dismissed, and the ambition of John Gotti. The end was coming, and it would arrive not in a courtroom or a prison cell, but in the heart of Manhattan, in a place where Castellano believed he was safe. By late 1985, the Gambino family was living in two worlds. In one, Paul Castellano still reigned as boss, presiding from his Staten Island mansion, planning legal defenses against federal indictments, and issuing orders to the captains who remained loyal. In the other, John Gotti and his allies whispered in back rooms, shaping a plan that would erase Castellano's rule forever. The two realities moved side by side, but they could not coexist. Castellano continued to act as though his position was secure. He believed his wealth, his lineage through Carlo Gambino, and his authority over the family made him untouchable. He trusted that his men, however frustrated, would remain obedient. What he didn't realize was that the foundation beneath him had already cracked. Without Agnello della Croce alive to demand loyalty, the soldiers no longer felt bound to Paul. They wanted a leader who walked among them, not one who dined in isolation. John Gotti sensed the moment had arrived. His crew at the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club, men like Frank DeCicco, Angelo Ruggiero, and Sammy the Bull Gravano, were ready. They knew Castellano was vulnerable not just because of the discontent in the ranks, but because of his legal troubles. With indictments looming, Castellano was distracted, focused on lawyers and courtrooms instead of his soldiers. The timing was perfect. Still, the decision to kill a sitting boss was enormous. It broke the unspoken rules of the Mafia. Traditionally, such a move required commission approval, and to act without it risked all-out war with the other families. But Gotti believed he had enough quiet support, or at least enough indifference, from other bosses. Castellano had few allies left. His arrogance had alienated many, and his focus on white-collar crime left him disconnected from men who valued tradition. The silence of the commission wasn't consent, but it was close enough. Planning the hit required precision. Castellano was a creature of habit, but his movements were closely watched by law enforcement. Striking him at home on Staten Island was too risky, and ambushing him on the street without careful planning could backfire. They needed a place where Castellano would feel secure, where he would lower his guard. That place would be Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan. The opportunity came in December 1985. Castellano was due to attend a meeting at Sparks with his new underboss, Thomas Bilotti. They were scheduled to discuss family matters with captains, including Gotti's own rivals. The meeting was meant to project Castellano's authority, to remind his men that he was still in charge despite the indictments. But in reality, it was the perfect trap. Gotti's crew prepared carefully. Teams were assigned, each man given a role. The shooters would be positioned outside the restaurant, blending into the crowd as though they were ordinary pedestrians on a winter evening. Backup cars would be nearby, ready to whisk them away. Gotti himself would sit in a vehicle close enough to watch but far enough to remain unseen. In the days leading up to the hit, tension ran high. The men involved knew the stakes. If they succeeded, Castellano would be dead, and Gotti would rise as boss. If they failed, the retaliation would be swift and merciless. They could not afford hesitation, not even for a second. Meanwhile, Castellano remained unaware of the storm gathering around him. He still believed Gotti was ambitious but controllable, another soldier whose loyalty could be bought or enforced. He focused on his trial strategy, complained about the constant surveillance, and tried to convince himself that his empire remained intact. He had no idea that some of the very men he thought he commanded had already chosen their side, and it was not his. As December 16th approached, everything was set. The shooters were ready, the plan was finalized, and Gotti's crew steeled themselves for what was to come. That night, the quiet rebellion that had been building for years would explode in a hail of bullets on a crowded Manhattan street. For Paul Castellano, Sparks Steakhouse was supposed to be another meeting, another chance to demonstrate control. For John Gotti, it was the moment to seize destiny. The line between boss and rival had been erased, and in the cold winter air of New York, history was about to be written in gunfire. The winter night was cold in Manhattan on December 16, 1985, the kind of sharp chill that made people quicken their pace along East 46th Street. Neon signs glowed against the darkness, and the soft hum of traffic filled the air. Sparks Steakhouse, one of the city's most popular restaurants, bustled with its usual mix of businessmen and diners, seeking a prime cut of beef in the warmth of its glowing interior. For Paul Castellano, it was just another evening, another meeting meant to project authority at a time when cracks had begun to show in his empire. Castellano's black Lincoln pulled up to the curb, driven by his trusted bodyguard and newly appointed underboss, Thomas Bilotti. Inside the car, Castellano sat with his usual composure, wearing a heavy coat against the cold. To him, this meeting was routine, a chance to reaffirm his leadership and remind his men that despite indictments and whispers, he was still the boss of the Gambino family. He had no idea that on the sidewalk surrounding the steakhouse men were waiting, their hands hidden in coats, their hearts steady with the knowledge that history was about to be rewritten. John Gotti sat nearby in a car watching through the windshield. He wasn't one of the shooters, too risky for a man of his ambition, but he needed to see it with his own eyes. This wasn't just an attack, it was a coup, the most daring strike in Mafia history since the days of Lucky Luciano. Gotti's men, disguised as ordinary passers-by, took their positions. Some held umbrellas to shield their faces, others loitered casually as though waiting for friends. Beneath the appearance of normalcy lay deadly intent. At approximately 5:26 p.m., the Lincoln slowed in front of Sparks. Castellano, unsuspecting, began to step out of the car. In that instant, the street erupted. 4 gunmen rushed forward, their pistols flashing in the cold air. Shots cracked, echoing between the buildings. Castellano collapsed on the sidewalk, his body jerking as bullets tore through him. Bilotti, trying to react, was gunned down almost simultaneously. The attack lasted only seconds, but in those seconds the entire structure of the Gambino family shifted. Pedestrians screamed and scattered. Some ducked into doorways, others ran into the street. Inside Sparks, diners froze at the sound. Forks paused midair as chaos unfolded just beyond the windows. For many New Yorkers, mob violence was something whispered about, something read in the tabloids. Now it was happening in plain sight, under neon lights, in the heart of Manhattan. Castellano lay lifeless on the pavement, his expensive coat darkened with blood. Bilotti's body slumped nearby, the car door still open. The shooters melted back into the crowd, disappearing into waiting vehicles. Within minutes they were gone, leaving behind 2 corpses and a city stunned. Gotti, watching from his car, saw what he needed to see. The boss was dead. The underboss was dead. The path was clear. Without saying a word, he ordered the driver to pull away. In the space of less than a minute, Paul Castellano's reign had ended, and Gotti's had begun. News of the hit spread quickly, faster than anyone could have imagined. Police cars swarmed the scene, sirens wailing, lights flashing against the winter night. Reporters rushed to Sparks, cameras flashing as they captured the site of the fallen Don. By the next morning, the photograph of Castellano's body sprawled on the sidewalk would be splashed across newspapers nationwide. For New Yorkers, the brazen nature of the killing was shocking. This wasn't a quiet assassination in a back alley or a discreet disappearance. This was an execution in the middle of Manhattan during the holiday season, outside one of the city's busiest restaurants. It was a statement, loud and unmistakable. Paul Castellano was gone, and the rules of the underworld had changed. Within the Gambino family, the message was equally clear. Soldiers who had grumbled about Castellano's arrogance and hypocrisy no longer had to whisper. The man they resented was dead, and John Gotti, the street boss who had given them respect, was the one who made it happen. For many, it was a moment of liberation. Loyalty shifted overnight, and Gotti's power surged like a tide. Law enforcement, however, saw something else. To the FBI and the NYPD, the hit on Castellano was a declaration of war against the very structure of the Mafia. It showed that the rules of restraint, the codes of tradition, could be broken when ambition demanded it. Killing a boss without commission approval had always been unthinkable, yet Gotti had done it, and done it in broad daylight. The brazen nature of the attack signaled a new era, one where visibility replaced subtlety and where bosses could be as flamboyant as the gangsters in movies. For Paul Castellano, the man who dreamed of turning the Gambino family into a corporation of white-collar rackets, the end was ironic. He had built his career on avoiding the spotlight, staying distant from street crime, and presenting himself as a businessman rather than a thug. Yet his death was as public and violent as any in Mafia history, a spectacle that would define his legacy more than any of his deals or business schemes. That night, while police cordoned off the scene and reporters scribbled frantic notes, Castellano's mansion in Staten Island stood quiet. Inside, his family received the news with shock, grief, and the heavy realization that their patriarch's empire had ended, not with courtroom drama, but with blood on a sidewalk. The wealth he had amassed, the influence he had wielded, the vision he had pursued, all of it collapsed in an instant. For the Gambino family, Sparks Steakhouse was not just a crime scene. It was a crossroads. The old order, represented by Castellano's corporate style of leadership, was gone. In its place stood John Gotti, the dapper Don, a man who embraced the spotlight Castellano shunned. The family's future would be very different, shaped not by boardroom deals but by the charisma and flamboyance of a boss who had rewritten the rules with bullets in the heart of Manhattan. The morning after Paul Castellano's death, New York awoke to headlines that read like something out of a gangster film. Front pages showed photographs of Castellano's lifeless body sprawled on the sidewalk outside Sparks Steakhouse, his expensive overcoat darkened with blood, his face partially covered by the chill night air. To ordinary citizens, it was surreal. Organized crime, long a shadowy rumor whispered about in back rooms, had exploded in the middle of Manhattan for everyone to see. Law enforcement moved quickly. Detectives flooded the crime scene, collecting shell casings, interviewing stunned witnesses, and reviewing every detail of the ambush. The FBI labeled it the most brazen Mafia hit in modern history. For decades, the bosses of New York's 5 families had been shielded by a certain untouchable aura. They ordered killings in secrecy, insulated from direct violence by layers of soldiers and captains. But here was Paul Castellano, the boss of the largest crime family in the country, gunned down in public view like any street soldier. It was unthinkable. The city buzzed with theories. Who ordered the hit? Was it the commission? Was it rival families? Or was it an inside job? To the FBI and NYPD, one name rose quickly to the surface: John Gotti. Surveillance had already tied him to discontent within the Gambino family, and his close relationship with Della Croce's faction made him the most likely challenger. But proving his role was another matter. The shooters vanished, the plan had been executed flawlessly, and the Mafia's code of silence ensured that no witnesses from within would talk. Inside the Gambino family, the power vacuum was filled almost immediately. John Gotti emerged as the new boss, his rise sealed by the very act of Castellano's murder. Soldiers who had grumbled under Castellano's aloof rule now rallied behind Gotti, the street general who had dared to do what no one else would. His charisma, his accessibility, and his defiance of tradition electrified the family. He was everything Castellano had not been: visible, flamboyant, and unafraid of the spotlight. In social clubs across Queens and Brooklyn, men toasted Gotti's ascension. Castellano had been viewed as arrogant, hypocritical, and disconnected. Gotti, by contrast, embodied the swagger of the old-school gangster. He wore tailored suits, mingled with his soldiers, and carried himself with the confidence of a man who knew he was untouchable. In killing Castellano, he not only eliminated a rival but won the loyalty of the men who longed for a leader they could believe in. But while the Gambino family celebrated, law enforcement seethed. Castellano's murder was proof that the Mafia's unwritten rules could no longer be trusted. For decades, bosses avoided such reckless spectacles, understanding that too much attention invited disaster. But Gotti's coup shattered that restraint. The FBI saw it as both an opportunity and a challenge. On one hand, the boldness of the hit drew public attention that fueled support for anti-mafia investigations. On the other, Gotti's rise meant facing a boss who seemed to revel in defiance. The commission, too, was shaken. Other bosses had tolerated Castellano, even respected his focus on white-collar rackets. But many disliked his arrogance. His murder, however, set a dangerous precedent. If one family could eliminate its boss without formal approval, what stopped others from doing the same? The delicate balance among the 5 families was destabilized, and the fear of chaos loomed. Yet, with Castellano gone, few openly challenged Gotti. His move had been risky, but it had also been effective. Meanwhile, Castellano's family mourned quietly. His wife, Nina, and their children grieved in Staten Island, away from the spotlight. For them, he was not just a boss or a businessman, but a husband and father. The funeral was somber, stripped of the grandeur one might expect for a Mafia don. In the world he left behind, there were no parades of respect, no tears from soldiers. Castellano had died isolated, and in death as in life he was seen by many of his men as a figure apart. In retrospect, his downfall seemed inevitable. Castellano had tried to reshape the Gambino family in his own image, favoring contracts and corporations over the grit of the streets. He had believed his vision of a white-collar empire would secure the family's future, but in doing so, he alienated the very men whose loyalty sustained him. His disdain for drug dealing clashed with the reality that narcotics were a lifeline for many soldiers. His seclusion in his mansion created distance. His absence from Agnello della Croce's funeral erased the last threads of respect. By the time bullets struck him outside Sparks, he was already alone. For the Mafia as a whole, the assassination marked a turning point. The old order, where bosses ruled through quiet influence and discretion, gave way to a new era of visibility and audacity. Gotti embraced the media attention Castellano shunned, and his reign became one of the most famous in Mafia history. But with that fame came scrutiny, and the FBI's determination to dismantle the Mafia grew stronger. Castellano's death was not just the end of a boss. It was the beginning of the end for the Mafia's golden age of secrecy. Newspapers framed the story as a clash of styles, the boardroom don versus the street don, the aloof businessman against the charismatic gangster. Castellano's legacy was that of a man who misunderstood the soul of his own family. He had wealth, power, and vision, but he lacked the connection that bound soldiers to their leaders. Gotti, for all his recklessness, gave the men what they craved: recognition, respect, and a leader who shared their world. The image of Castellano's body outside Sparks Steakhouse became iconic, a symbol of both his fall and the ruthless nature of the world he tried to control. For the public, it was unforgettable. For the Gambino family, it was transformative. For the Mafia, it was a warning. Even bosses could be disposable when they lost the loyalty of their men. Paul Castellano's journey from a Brooklyn butcher's son to the head of the Gambino crime family was shaped as much by circumstance as by ambition. He was not the stereotypical gangster that the public imagined. He didn't swagger on street corners with a pistol in his belt, nor did he crave the smoky glamour of social clubs packed with soldiers. Instead, he carried himself as a businessman, a man who wanted to lift the Mafia into boardrooms and contract negotiations, far from the street-level violence that had defined so many of his contemporaries. For a time, his vision worked, but in the world he chose, vision alone was never enough. Castellano's rise was steady and deliberate. His marriage into Carlo Gambino's family tied him to power, but his own abilities made him indispensable. Where others saw risk, Paul saw opportunity. He looked at construction unions and understood that controlling them meant controlling the skyline of New York. He studied the trucking industry and realized that no garment, no shipment, no delivery could move without his blessing. He surrounded himself with men who could execute his strategies and ensured that the Gambino family's reach extended beyond gambling halls into industries that seemed respectable on the surface. His wealth grew, and so did his confidence. By the time Carlo Gambino named him successor in 1976, Castellano believed he had proven himself. He saw the Gambino family not as a criminal outfit, but as a corporation, with himself as CEO. His Staten Island mansion, dubbed the White House, reflected his aspirations. He wasn't content to be a street boss. He wanted to be remembered as the man who transformed the Mafia into something more enduring. His dinners were lavish, his conversations intellectual, his focus on the future. To Castellano, respect was earned through vision and wealth, not through charisma or shared hardship. But therein lay the flaw. The men who lived and bled in the streets didn't want a corporate executive. They wanted a boss who understood them, who showed his face in their clubs, who spoke their language. Castellano's distance from his soldiers created resentment. His disdain for narcotics clashed with the reality that many relied on drug profits to survive. His demands for larger tributes while condemning the means of earning them felt hypocritical, and his personal choices, most notably his affair with Gloria Olarte, made him seem careless, even ridiculous, in a world where image was everything. Agnello Della Croce's presence kept Castellano safe for years. Della Croce was the underboss who commanded respect, who soothed discontent, who reminded his men that loyalty to the family was sacred. As long as Della Croce lived, Castellano's authority, though begrudged, remained intact. But when Della Croce died in December 1985, the dam broke. Castellano's decision to skip his funeral, whether out of fear of FBI surveillance or personal arrogance, was a mistake from which he could not recover. To the soldiers, it was proof that their boss had no respect for tradition, no loyalty to the men beneath him. In that moment, Castellano lost not just their admiration but their protection. John, Gotti seized the opportunity. Everything Castellano was not, Gotti embodied. He was present, visible, charismatic. He laughed with his men, shared their burdens, and rewarded their loyalty. Where Castellano represented distance, Gotti represented connection. Soldiers rallied to him not only because of his ambition, but because he gave them something their boss could not: a sense of belonging. The decision to eliminate Castellano was not just Gotti's ambition, it was the soldiers' revenge. The assassination outside Sparks Steakhouse was the culmination of years of tension. Castellano's dream of leading the Mafia into legitimacy ended not in boardrooms, but in gunfire on a Manhattan sidewalk. It was the ultimate irony. A man who sought to avoid the brutality of street violence died in the most brutal way possible, in front of startled pedestrians and flashing neon lights. His fall was a spectacle, a message to the underworld and the world beyond that no boss, no matter how wealthy or insulated, was beyond the reach of betrayal. In death, Castellano's legacy was complicated. To some, he was a visionary, a man who understood that the future of organized crime lay in contracts and corporations, not bullets. His methods kept the Gambino family rich, and his strategies laid groundwork that outlasted him. But to others, he was arrogant, hypocritical, and disconnected. He forgot that respect in the Mafia is not only commanded, it is shared. He misunderstood